Welcome to the second episode of our podcast, and today we're going to focus on relationships in times of COVID. There are a lot of questions, there's a lot of interest in how are we going to thrive in this situation? Is it going to be good for the relationship? Is it going to be bad? So we're going to give our perspective a very nuanced view, and as always I have two guests who are going to share their ideas about relationships in times of COVID. So maybe you can introduce yourself.
Oh, well, I'm enriches. I'm currently doing my master's at Maastricht University in neuropsychology, and yeah.
Okay, welcome.
Yeah, my name's Fabian. I'm a second-year master's student at UM, and like Enriches, I'm also a member of the student council, and I'm happy to be here.
Likewise.
Okay. Great. Well, as I said in the introduction, there's a lot of interest on this topic because especially also the media is speculating a lot, like, is it going to be a baby boom? Is there going to be a wave of divorce? We all have these assumptions, and of course the data are still coming in. So there are also some first research data on how we're actually doing in this time in terms of relationship. But yeah, I think it's good to sort of talk a little bit about it and to sort of to see like what could be potential challenges and could it be also have positive effects? Could there be an opportunity here? Let's just go ahead.
For sure, totally agreed. Yeah, I feel like a lot of people talk about the current situation we're in, and not a day goes by that we have discussions about the impact of COVID, but people don't usually focus on their love life. So that's very important to discuss. Yeah.
I think love life is one thing. It's also the sex love life.
Oh, yeah.
That's also even more. I mean, it seems that there is kind of an illusion of openness in the media that everyone is talking about sex, but when it really comes to your own sexual relationship or talking with your partner about sex, there's still some shame. And I feel that still people didn't really learn to talk about sex. And I think that's also one of the aims of this podcast, is to make it a very common topic that we can sort of see that this is an important part of the relationship, your sexuality. So learning to talk about it, I think, is very important. So I'm really happy that you're so open to talk about sex and relationships.
So you just already said in the beginning that there is already some research on how COVID might have impacted relationship life. Very broadly, what are sort of the most outstanding things that we already can see?
Yeah, I think what is most interesting is that we see very different patterns. And I think it really depends on, first of all, how stressed you are. I mean, whether some people are stressed about the situation or worrying about their health, about the health of people around them. But there are also some people who are not stressed. So it really depends on the level of stress. It also depends on how do you deal with this spending more time together, and also the quality of your relationship beforehand. I mean, if you had a good connection with your partner and good relationship, there's a better chance that you will thrive better in this situation than when the relationship was already not that well. So I think it's really difficult to make uniform conclusions on what the impact is.
I agree, and I think especially like the duration of the relationship has a huge impact.
Exactly.
I feel like the couples who've been together for quite a while, who weren't able to spend a lot of time together before COVID, now have the opportunity to get to know one another, relearn their love languages, and relearn how the other partner wants to be loved. And I feel like those couples are really thriving, but there are also couples who are just finding it a bit difficult to just see the other partner at an eye level, and there's a lot of communication that goes over each other's heads. And I feel like that is one thing that I see very common, like that is a common thing, at least in the student population. Yeah, exactly. And I think that this is important to realize how different we are, and that we all have our very unique love map and sex map. And this diversity is clearly part of this COVID situation, that we react differently. And I think when we look at the data nowadays, it seems that people in a relationship, there are people who have no change in their sexual behavior. There are people who have more sex, enjoy it more. There are people who have less sex, more sexual problems, or have less sex but more adventurous sex. So we see very different patterns going on, and I think that's really interesting. So it's really difficult to make these uniform conclusions, and I think it's also important not to do it, because then we do not want to create new norms, and because it can create performance demand. If you read like, hey, we are doing good and this is an opportunity to reinvent your sex life, people can get sort of stressed about that. So I think we have to be aware of the fact that there's so much difference.
Totally agreed. I think we're in a time where it's become pretty apparent that we're diverse on sort of every level. Yeah. So couples have more sex or less sex, or it doesn't change. And you talked about stress as one factor. So, I mean, I can imagine that stress kind of reduces your libido. Is that true?
It is. There's, again, a different reaction. For some people, stress can be an enhancer of sexual desire. We know that, for example, during exam periods, there are a lot of students masturbating then because it's a release. And of course, masturbation is something different than having sex
right?
with a partner. That's true. Yeah. But still, it's about this relief. For some people, stress and anxiety can increase your sexual desire, but we often also see that it decreases sexual desire. And I think it has a little bit to do with the fact that sexual desire is not something that spontaneously pops up out of the blue. I mean, it's often there needs to be a sexual stimulus, something that triggers your sexual system. Somebody takes the initiative at a certain point, and then you sort of decide whether you go with it or not. And if you feel stressed or maybe there's some relationship tension or whatsoever, then maybe you're less motivated to open yourself for that sexual stimulation, or you're less motivated to create an opportunity to have sex. So that's one of the reasons why, when feeling stressed, people kind of retract from having sex. Yeah.
Apart from stress, of course, COVID is a stressful situation. But on the other hand, I also feel like a very important dynamic in relationships at the moment is closeness, distance. Before, you had this very lively situation. You could do whatever and travel, all sorts of free time activities. And now that's not so much the case anymore. And people may have even had to move in together.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of sort of closeness in the sense of proximity. Yeah. It's like, even I know so many students and older couples who've just, after a while of fighting, they're like, where do I go? How do I get out of the situation? Who do I talk to? I can't just simply go over to my friend's place for the night. And then they really have to deal with the situation hands-on. And I think it's more about the fact that some couples they've really had to learn how to change the way they communicate and talk. And the dynamic has overall just completely changed. And like you said, like stress and anxiety has a huge effect on even just the way you converse and the way you develop a dynamic with a partner.
True,
exactly,
and it's definitely connected.
I think also what you're addressing, the fact that there is less distraction, that's also an important thing, because for a lot of couples, their relationship works as long that they can go out to study or take lessons or work or go out with friends, and then suddenly you're constantly together with your partner, and then you feel like, oh my God, I feel like we are missing something. It feels empty. I feel there's like some emotional closeness between us, and I think that's important. And indeed, we do see that this balance of what we call separateness and togetherness is very important, in the sense that you want to have a sense of closeness, commitment in your relationship, but at the same time there needs to be autonomy and differentiation and me time. When it's too much about we and doing everything together and this enmeshed feeling instead of you and me, and we are still separate people, then it really kills sexual desire. So it's kind of a paradox between lust and love. On the one hand, we want security, we want stability in our relationship. That's why we want to sort of stick with one partner. But at the same time, it's the killer of sexual desire, because sexual desire thrives on mystery and excitement and novelty. So at a certain point, spending all this time together means that you're constantly together. There's no shortage anymore to desire. Yeah. And so that has an impact on our sexual desire. So it's really a challenge to, in the situation of being constantly together, trying to create some mystery, trying to bring in some novelty, trying to see your partner through a new gaze. What I sometimes advise to couples is like, maybe you can look for a new hobby or try something else, and maybe suddenly your partner starts to become a very passionate cook.
Together?
No, separately. Separately, that he starts to cook, and then you can sort of admire him again.
See him in a different light.
Yeah, you see him in a different light. You see or her, you just say like, hey, I didn't know that. Or maybe one partner read an interesting book and starts to talk very passionate about it, and you think like, hey, I didn't know that you were so opinionated about this. And that can sort of bring a new dynamic in the relationship. So it's really about, within this situation of being together for a long time and knowing each other so well, or being constantly together, trying to find out some mystery, some new things to discover.
I think it's about spicing it up a little bit. I feel like nowadays, with just like the routine is so monotonous. You get up in the morning, take a shower, you start studying or working, your work is done, you either continue working or you go back into your daily life. And I feel like that just routine can sometimes dry a relationship out. And then people, at least because we know that this is an exceptional time, they immediately think, oh no, something's wrong with my relationship. And then they cast this entire sort of like cloud over their entire relationship as this is not working. And like, you know, I think, do you feel like couples make a lot of more like rash decisions now as compared to before?
Yeah, I mean, there is some data indicating that there are some divorces or breakups more nowadays than it was before. And I think, I mean, we have to advise couples, do not make hasty decisions. These are exceptional times. And I think that we are all stressed. It's exceptional. So we cannot ignore the problems, obviously, because when you face, okay, we are like too much differentiated, there's too little connection anymore. I mean, of course, I mean, you have to do something with it, but
there's a difference between talking about it, addressing the issue together, and making decisions on the basis of, hey, this is not going to work out.
Yeah, exactly.
And I feel like that's such a fundamental human property to kind of not see a situation as temporary, but to always feel like, oh, this is sort of the new normal. This is how it's going to always be.
Exactly.
And I feel like in that way, sure, people don't see that the pandemic has this very impactful effect, but still momentary on your relationship.
But I think also a lot of young couples, at least, they immediately when a problem arises, they attach the problem to the person rather than saying, this is you and I as a couple, and this is a problem, and we're going to solve the problem. What they start doing is that they're like, oh, he's not talking to me, or she's not paying enough attention, she's the issue. And then by calling her out as the issue, then you're creating so much distance within communication, within the dynamic of the relationship. You are bringing in air bubbles of doubt into the
it's a typical communication problem. It's about, that's what we always say to couples, talk about your own feelings and talk about yourself and then how you deal as a couple, but not trying to accuse the other. I think that's really a thing. And
not to make hasty assumptions. Like I feel like it's so important to genuinely, even if that feels a little forced sometimes, so important to just ask your partner how they feel about certain things, because sometimes, sure, you can make a lot of assumptions, but really knowing and hearing it from them, that makes such a difference.
Thought reading, don't do it, I think. But I think what basically here is also about this situation is what we know, what is a key element of a good sexual relationship is variation and flexibility. It's the ability to adapt yourself to changing life circumstances. And I think this is also a good situation. This is a challenging time, so you need to adapt. And I mean, you will face other issues in the course of your relationship, like having a child for the first time. That's also disrupting your balance and your routine. How do you deal with it? You also need to be flexible. So this is kind of also a situation in which you need to learn to be flexible and adapt to circumstances.
I completely agree. I think it's just another phase where people have to really quickly adapt and just find new ways of communicating healthily. Also, like redefining their dynamics sexually. Like how is this going to affect my mental health, and how is this change in my mental health going to translate into changes in my dynamic within communications and within sex.
I think what you were addressing at a certain point was about routines, and that you say people have like now very much routines, but I think it's also an opportunity to create new routines, because also before the COVID situation, maybe there was a routine in terms of we always do it the same way. We meet on that day, and then we have sex, and then we have sex in that way. So there's a lot of routine there. And I think it's also a time to sort of reconnect, reinvest in the relationship, try out new things.
Reinvent, because what you said, this sort of habit before COVID kind of fosters this expectation on how it should be and how it should continue to be, right? And I feel like there it's an important thing to address the fact that we are in a different situations, and sort of the circumstances around being together might have changed. So you also have to change the expectations. Exactly.
And I think it's also a good opportunity to sort of try out new things and about also prioritize the relationship again, because before there was so much things. There was the FOMO, we have to be everywhere, and all the parties and all the, and then a lot of people are spending spending a lot of time on social media and so on. And now it's also the time, like, okay, like make your relationship priority again, and make the effort. That's also a very important thing about relationship. It's really about making the effort.
Conscious effort.
Yeah, the conscious effort to invest in the relationship and to invest in your sexual relationship.
Yeah. And I think it's like also, besides just investing in the relationship, also to invest in yourselves and into yourself and understanding, hey, how do I feel? Am I feeling the way I used to feel?
Yeah.
Like, what has changed? And then communicating that with your partner, because I think there is this misconception of like, my partner knows everything about me. He can read me. She knows what I'm thinking about. And just communicating like, hey, actually, I'm struggling a little bit. How are you doing this? How are you seeing this? And I just think that friendly, open communication just changes the entire dynamic, because then the other person knows what's going on in your head without having to assume. And like you said, this thoughting and thinking about everything, I think that creates this cloud of confusion and like sort of like ambiguity as well.
Yeah, exactly. And it's also a myth. It's the myth in the relationship, like if he loves me enough, then he knows how I feel. Or also the myth on sexuality and on the level of sexuality, like if he knows me, he knows what I like. And open communication is not only like how are you feeling in the relationship, it's also in terms of sexuality, openly communicating what do I like and what do I don't like. Obviously, first you need to know for yourself. I mean, discover yourself, and we are going to talk about that in another episode also about masturbation and about how to learn yourself and what you need for sexual stimulation and to reach orgasm. I think you need to know it, but then also communicate it to your partner and tell him or her what you need is very important, and it can sort of really bring some deep closeness in your relationship and some
I agree. I think especially couples who are doing long distance relationship, it's so difficult to keep yourself sexually active, because it's like, oh, I've had a busy day, and then you forget about it, and then it's also about, it's a bit of like the planning of it, like, hey, let's maybe make this call. And I know so many friends who do that, and it's worked for them, and it's just this sort of clarity of like, this is how we're going to do it, this is, you know, the times have changed, and it's just like the demands have changed as well. So it's just like, this works, maybe this doesn't work. And I know so many couples, because of COVID, have had to spend so much time apart as well. Besides the excessive closeness, as the whole other the whole other story of people having to spend a lot of time apart.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure. I mean, long distance relationships can not regularly see each other now. Apart from FaceTime maybe, but right, traveling, just, you know, going to a different country to see your partner, that's not possible at the moment.
And it's really a challenge also for people who do not live together. I mean, for a certain period the rules were very strict, and then it was really difficult if you live in different cities and indeed in different countries. So
and you feel so unsure, can I travel now? You know, you have this big longing to see some, and that's natural, and it's you know, also a very nice thing to have, right? But then this kind of gets mingled with this stigma or say sort of social confusion on what's now appropriate to do.
It is. I think it's important. It's very counterintuitive, the situation. I mean, it's very normal, and you want to have the closeness and so on, but it's kind of a paradox, because it's this closeness that at this point is kind of scary now, because how close can we be? And that's a whole other discussion, but it is something we need to think about. What I also think about in your situation, you were explaining about long distance relationship, you have to sort of plan and try out things about sexuality. I think it's also interesting to reflect a little bit on that, about the planning of sexuality and about making the effort and creating opportunities to have sex, because that's often what we also say in this situation is like try out new things, in the sense of spicing things up, trying, just doing sexting or turning each other on, creating opportunities, make you feel good about yourself is also important. Self-care is also a very important part here, that you just make sure that you feel good about yourself. So invest time in sports and healthy food. I think that's also important, because feeling yourself attractive is also an important stimulus to have sex.
Sure.
Totally agreed. And I feel like that's, to tie it back to COVID, such an important thing right now, because we do not have to leave the house. And so much of what you talked about, self-care and kind of being more particular about what you do, what you eat, how you look, has kind of faded away a little bit because we don't have to leave the house, right?
Yeah.
We are in front of the screen. You might as well wear no pants.
And a lot of people are doing
your
that.
colleagues are not going to see it.
It's also so many people are spending more time in their pajamas and it's just like not putting the effort in themselves. And I think that is
in themselves and in each other.
Yeah.
Also your partner. I mean, you also have to realize before, for example, if you're in a relationship and your partner was going out and he was always dressed up and suddenly you're seeing him all the time in his joggings watching the screen. I mean, there's kind of that can do something with your sexual attraction. So it's making the effort. It's important for yourself and for the partner.
Yeah, and you did say that sexual desire does not come from somewhere, and it's not this sort of mystery thing that pops up randomly, but it does have a certain release. And I feel like we attribute that to just this very, very short period of time before we have sex. But in reality, sexual desire is something that kind of stays relevant
exactly
24/7, right?
I think your foreplay does not start in the bedroom. Your foreplay actually starts after the last time you had sex. That you're already preparing the next time. It's really about investing in each other. It's about being nice to each other, giving each other compliments, which is also an important part. Like this idea of seduction and flirting and making the other feel good about yourself, making sure that you know, hey, I love you and I appreciate you. We do that a lot in the beginning of the relationship. We invest a lot of time, but when you're like 2 years together, 3 years together, it erodes. And that's a little bit the thing. What also happens is that then we become more dependent on compliments from the outside because you go to school and then somebody's like, hey, you're not, wearing a nice shirt and your hair looks nice, and you need these compliments to feel better about yourself. And I think in long-term relationship it's also important that you do not depend on these external compliments, but make sure that as a partner you still sort of compliment the other one and give positive messages.
I totally get you when you're saying that, you know, you don't want to have only compliments from the outside. You kind of don't want to lose that connection to your partner in that sense, but you also want to stay honest about it, right? And so what I wouldn't agree with is just making compliments out of desire. You need to stay honest. And
if you gained 5 pounds and you don't like it, you can be honest and say that. Like, hey, maybe.
And in such a situation, you have to have this balance of being honest, talking about stuff, and addressing issues if they really concern you. But trying to be as sort of nice and as forthcoming as possible, right?
Indeed. It's about this positive vibe, creating some kind of idea. Like it's also feeling commitment is also about being safe, having a safe context that you can share positive and negative things with, and that you can know, hey, I can trust my partner and we can discuss all these different things. And this idea of connection is really important because what we know about sex, it's about stimulation, getting the right stimulation. It's about open communication, and it's about being in a good, safe context in which you can explore yourself and each other, in which you can sort of be open to be yourself. And these are important ingredients of sexuality. And I think that especially in this challenging COVID time, we need to invest about, making sure that there is stimulation, making sure that there is open communication, and making sure that there is a nice, positive context and that you're open to each other. I think this is really important.
And it might not go by itself, because that's also something, right? You discover something new about your partner, and that also holds true for COVID in terms of how important is it to me actually to look nice? Do I do it for myself, and would I continue doing it if I don't leave the house, or do I completely stop? And then there might be a mismatch in terms of what your partner feels they want to do themselves about their appearance and what you might want from them. And talking about that could be difficult, but it's still important to maintain that healthy balance of sexual desire.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, of course, it's not that you have to dress up all the time. I mean, you can sort of do a Netflix evening in your joggings in pajamas, and that can be nice. But it's more, I think that the dressing up is more about making the effort, and it's also about sort of planning a situation to become sexual. And I know that for a lot of couples, this is sort of this idea that, sex needs to be planned. And as a sexologist, we're always very much in favor of the agenda sex. And the reason is because there's so much going on in our life. We plan everything, and especially also in this COVID, you have these routines, and if you're like in a situation in which you have like children or in long-term relationship, and there's so much going on, working at home, teaching at home, and so on, then we often sort of, where's the sex? Because there's no time. I mean, and it's also about creating this kind of date night, like bringing in food, dressing up, playing restaurant, and being nice to each other, so that there is a context in which you can be sexual, because otherwise the days just pass by,
and it becomes this sort of monotonous routine.
Yeah.
But reflecting back on the conversation on self-care, there is this common thing going on where people are staying in their pajamas and their hair is undone, and they've spent the entire day looking like a little potato, and it's okay, you know, it's each to their own kind of thing. But I think that is definitely reflected largely on the desire for the other person. You see this person completely transform to like how you first saw them and how you're now seeing them on a daily basis, and obviously that changes the kind of the sort of attraction. But what would you recommend for those couples to do then, also when they're in that situation where they're in a conflict of their desire?
Yeah, I think that when you have this lower desire, it's always the first question is like, okay, what is it like? Is it what is low desire? Is it because of I don't feel my partner attractive when he's like always wearing his joggings and so on? But it can be more than that. It's about because you feel stressed, or maybe it's like maybe you feel kind of frustrated that you're constantly you're doing the same things all the time, or maybe, I mean, what was exciting in the beginning of the relationship cannot maybe less exciting after a while. So it's also, that's all different reasons why low desire can have to do with this distance, this separateness, closeness balance. So I think it's really about reflecting. Often we have this discrepancy in sexual desire. We have to realize that we all have our unique love map and our sex map. So it's really, really strange for people to have always desire sex at the same time and desire the same thing, because we're so different. So we often need to compromise. That's very normal in a relationship. And then it's about, okay, how you can sort of write down even your sexual wishes, like what do you want, and then sort of bring these lists together and see like, hey,
that's a very cool suggestion.
Yeah, it's something that opened the conversation. You can sort of do it in a game, like you write your wishes on cards and you put it in a box, and then you just say like, okay, 2 evenings in the week, we just take a card of the box and we discuss it. Like one time it's your box and the other time it's your box. And you don't have to do it. I mean, you have to respect each other's boundaries, but at least you have the conversation and you learn to know each other better on a sexual level. So it's often really about communication, compromising, and it's also about realizing that in terms of sexual desire, there's often somebody who has more desire than the other at a certain point, and then this person can take the initiative. And at that point, maybe you think like, I don't feel like having sex now, but open yourself for it. Just give it like, let's say 10 minutes and see what it does. Start to kiss and cuddle, and maybe the desire will grow. And that's again, this idea of making time for it, open yourself for it, being motivated. And when are you more motivated? When the relationship is going better, and when you feel safe and secure, and when you feel sexually attractive to yourself and attracted to your partner, you will be more motivated to open yourself for the sexual stimulation.
But very important just to keep in mind while you're doing that, while you're saying to yourself like, hey, I'm going to give it a try, right? These just going to see for the first 10 minutes, to clearly communicate that, so that it's quite clear also to the partner, like, you know, that to manage expectations in a way.
Yeah, right? Exactly.
You don't want to have that just going on inside of your head.
No, it has to be. I mean, when we say like about the 10-minute rule, another rule, it's more like you just say like, let's see what happens, and if after 10 minutes you feel like, no, it doesn't start, I just don't feel like it, then at least you have 10 minutes of cuddling and kissing, and that's okay.
And so the closeness comes in, then it's like at least you're still trying to participate in that kind of activity. And I think, like you said, I think communicating like, hey, I'm going to give this a 10-minute go, and then we'll see how it develops.
Yeah, exactly.
Because I feel like it can be sometimes really heartbreaking for the other partner if the other person doesn't communicate this 10-minute thing. Yeah. And then the other part, and then it just creates so much distance emotionally, sexually, and you just feel like you can't talk to this person or be like, hey, I have this need, could you please fulfill it?
Exactly. But it actually all comes down to good communication. I think that's really important. And I think it's just good about this openness about sexuality. It's more like people sometimes feel like frustrated by this immediate rejection. And I think it's just good sort of to sort of compromise themselves, meeting halfway. And it also in terms of desire, what we often see, there's one partner who can have higher desire than the other partner, and don't take the higher desire partner as the norm.
Yeah, because there is no norm.
There is no norm. Yeah. It's why do this partner needs to level up to this level? I mean, it's about meeting each other halfway. And I think that's really important, that in a lot of relationship, it's about compromise. And especially in these COVID times, that idea of compromise is so important. It's on so many different levels. It's not only on the sexual level. It's really about how are we going to make this work? And it's about giving and taking. And I think that's really an important challenge and advice in this situation. Yeah.
So earlier you said sexologists are about agenda sex, and I found that very interesting, this notion of planning sex, because it's so counterintuitive to say, like a in layman's terms, because a lot about sex and when to have sex is about when you feel like having sex, and that to most people seems like you cannot plan.
Yeah, I know. I can understand.
So what is it about planning sex?
Well, I think it's about planning. Of course, you cannot plan when will you be in the mood, but it's more like creating the opportunity to get in the mood. It's not about planning the desire, like, okay, tomorrow at 9 I will have the desire to have sex. It's about creating a context in which you can become horny, and in which you can sort of turn each other on. And I think that is the most important part. It's not about making desire, it's making the context work so that you can create desire. And what I often hear in couples is that they say, like, yeah, but it needs to be spontaneous and you cannot plan it because in the beginning of our relationship it was so spontaneous. And then I always wonder, like, yeah, how spontaneous was it exactly? Because if you start dating and you know you will meet your partner, you make sure that you're showered and have nice lingerie, and because you're planning in your head that you will have sex. So it's not that spontaneous. We plan a lot. I mean, if you're thinking about, it's also part of the excitement. It's about meeting your partner and mentally getting excited and taking care of yourself and creating a context. That's what we do in the beginning of a relationship. You give each other compliments. You sort of start actually the foreplay via messages and so on. Yeah. So that's what we actually want to aim for, is that not sit on the couch and watching a TV show and then waiting until the sexual desire suddenly pops up. It's not going to, there needs to be something going on.
So a little bit like in the start of the relationship, because I could very much relate to that. Like, you're always on call in a way, and you might not know, okay, I am going to have sex, but you anticipate it.
Exactly.
And maintaining that. So
exactly, and it's about creating this context. It does not mean, hey, now we have to have sex. It's more about bringing each other in the mood and see what happens.
Creating that opportunity also doesn't mean that you then have to go through with it, but to have a mutual understanding with the partner that if that doesn't work out in the end, it's no biggie.
No, you had a nice evening, you had a dinner date, you sort of had a nice conversation, nice talk, maybe you cuddled and kissed a little bit, and that's it.
And this relates back to what we talked about earlier, right? The 10-minute rule, I think you called it. Yeah. That this is the same thing. If it ends up not working out, you can kind of tie these two concepts together. You still had 10 minutes of cuddling and being close, and totally works.
I think that's the main issue of this planning idea.
But so the concept of sexual arousal, sexual desire, that these two terms were kind of used now, and I'm still unclear. Is there a difference between the two? Are they the same?
No, well, there's a difference in the sense that arousal is more about how your body reacts and how you feel, and then desire is more the motivation to do something with it. And I think that one of the most important things that we used to think about sexuality in terms of the sexual response cycle, that it starts with desire, and then there's arousal, and then you reach orgasm, and then there's a recovery phase. But there has been some criticism, like, this isn't linear. I mean, it's not suddenly desire. Often what we see is that there is a stimulus, you notice it, and often automatically your body starts to react. So even when you're not aware of the stimulus, your body will kind of react. And the moment you become aware of this beginning arousal, you start to pay more attention to it, you elaborate on it, and then you feel the desire. Then you consciously evaluate the stimulus, you give meaning to it, whether, am I going to expect something nice to happen? Is it going to be a reward? And then you feel the desire to engage and to do something with it. So often what we see is that desire is actually the result of beginning arousal. And that's why, and especially for women, what we see is that often when there's no arousal, there's no desire. When there's no desire, there's no arousal. what we sometimes see for men, it can be that you can have a strong desire and still have an erectile problem, which is then an arousal disorder. But that's so there is a difference. But at the same time, it's often like a circular movement that arousal and desire sort of enhance each other.
No, I mean, it's very, like, you can see this in day-to-day examples where, like, you know, when you start liking someone, everything they do, you have an eye on it. You're like, oh, did you see the way she looked at me? Or did you see the way he did it? And it's because you're trying to match the desire and the arousal.
Exactly.
And for example, a simple touch becomes like, oh.
Yeah.
You know, like, it like, those feelings also enhance, and then you think about it, and it creates more desire, and because you've been aroused.
Yeah, exactly.
So if those two terms work together, in a lot of ways, it's at least in the start of the relationship, and like I think some couples have a hard time keeping that up.
Yeah.
When, you know, in a long-term relationship, but also now in COVID, it's very difficult to keep that desire going when things have shifted.
So it might actually be a good, I mean, correct me if you disagree, but it might actually be a nice exercise for people with their partner to kind of pay attention to what does evoke arousal, what does evoke sexual desire in what my partner does.
Exactly. And I think what is interesting is it touches upon what we often do in sex therapy, centered focus exercises. And centered focus is about touching each other and about exploring each other's body. And what we often do is then it's about just paying attention to your bodily reactions, and don't label it as arousal. Don't look for arousal or orgasm. Don't see it as a foreplay for sex or penetration. It's more about just being aware of your body and how different parts of your body feel differently, and that when I touch my arm, it's different than when I touch my neck, and so on. And that is a very good exercise, because as I indicated, like, this arousal and these bodily signals are important, and becoming aware of how your body reacts is an important part of sexuality. So it's also about how your body reacts, and also about the meaning you give to sexual stimuli is important. And it's about just letting go all these distracting ideas. What sometimes people have is that during sex you're thinking about other things, or you think like, oh, maybe I have some fat here and he will see that, and you have all these distracting thoughts, and you become sort of a spectator of your own sexuality. And then you lose your interest, or you lose your arousal, because you're like in a meta perspective. You're not
experiencing it.
And so that's a very good exercise to bring yourself back to your body, and to bring yourself back to what you're actually experiencing, and becoming in the moment again.
But so that also means that the better you are at doing that, and at knowing the interaction between your partner and you, and what creates arousal or what creates sexual desire, the better you are at giving the opportunity to have sex.
Exactly. It's also, it's good in the sense that knowing what the other want, but always be careful that it not becomes kind of a mechanical, efficient way of having sex. Because what we sometimes see also in the beginning of the relationship, why is it spontaneous and so good, the sex? Because you're exploring, and that's exciting. You're discovering new areas, and at a certain point
you don't want to just push buttons.
Exactly. But that's what happens at a certain point. You know the button. When I push this button, it turns him on, and when I push this button, she will reach orgasm. And at a certain point, you kind of skip the exploration, and you just start to push the buttons, and then it becomes boring.
And I think it becomes a habit then, because you get into the habit of pushing those specific buttons, and you can completely forget like what you're really doing, and the whole living in the moment situation with your partner. I think that's where maybe the disconnect sometimes comes, like with the arousal and the desire, because maybe you've aroused them, but you haven't created that desire necessarily.
Exactly. It's about building up and exploring, and also realizing that these button works in the beginning of the relationship, but after 10 years of pushing these buttons, maybe you want another button.
That button has a dent in it.
I mean, that's what happens. What used to be fun can be less fun after 10 years. So it's about, again, this reinventing and creating and variation, and rewriting your sexual script.
Discovering new opportunities.
Yeah.
And that ties back with this statement that we made earlier, that, you know, foreplay is kind of 24/7.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly. Exactly.
But so talking about planned sex, and this is speaking out of a viewpoint on couples who are close and who have the opportunity to be sexual, virtually all the time. Now with COVID, it's definitely much more even. But for long distance relationships, partners who can only see each other via screen, planned sex has a whole different meaning.
Yeah, it can be frustrating now to have to plan sex all the time. Yeah.
So how do long distance relationships manage to kind of give opportunity to sexual moments between each other?
I think it's a challenge. I think nowadays there are much more new technology, and we're going to devote a podcast also on these different possibilities of cyber sex and virtual sex, and you have all these toys that you can sort of stimulate each other
Remote
from a
control
distance.
toys, right?
Remote control toys. So, I mean, there are some opportunities, and there is the webcam sex and the sexting and all these things. Of course, always have to be careful with that because, you have to trust
Data
your
protection.
partner,
Yeah,
especially make sure that there's no abuse afterwards. But it's important that you try to use these different tools that are available nowadays to be sexual. So I think, it's about being more inventive and being a little bit more creative. And also, I think what is important to broaden our definition of sexuality, because sexuality can also be creating intimacy, sharing fantasies, sharing thoughts about turning each other on via phone, via sexting, can also be a part of sexuality. It's not only about being together and doing the sexual act. You can also create a lot of sexual connection in other ways. And I think that's also one of the challenges for being in a long distance relationship. It's like at a distance still being sexually connected.
I think it's also one of those like sexual myths. Like people just think like, oh, you can't be sexually aroused from that far apart. But the thing is, it's like if you communicate right and if you try to explore the different mediums, you will find something that works for you. It's about finding and exploring, and I think also giving up the hesitation. I think maybe there's a bit of a stigma as well attached to using sort of apps and also using these remote control sex toys. So I think it's about destigmatizing as well. That is required for people to actually fully explore this.
Yeah, exactly.
I can definitely relate to that. I feel like a lot of people don't feel comfortable at first. So what you just said is actually in my opinion, a very good tip. Try out different media and different ways of sort of being sexual at a distance.
Yeah, and seeing what works for you.
How else would you recommend long distance partners to kind of familiarize themselves more with being sexual at a distance?
I think it's really about doing it. It's about exposure and trying out new things, and because it's the only way. I mean, if you don't want to use all these tools, that's okay. But then you have to just accept that your sexuality,
it's in some way.
Yeah, and it's about opening the conversation and then seeing like, is this something you want to try? Of course, you have to agree both. I mean, there's consent, mutual consent is very important, obviously. So it's about finding a way and to make it work indeed.
And it's also trial and error. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. You know.
Yeah.
I think
and being forgiving,
right?
To yourself, of course, to your partner, but in a relationship, if it doesn't work out perfectly.
Yeah, and I think it's also what is important is having some kind of a perspective, and that's why this perspective. I mean, in a long distance relationship, you can use all these tools, and it can also sort of create. It heats you up, and then at that moment we will meet, and then we can sort of do it together. And this is like all this building up. It's
frenzy.
Like 3-4 months of foreplay, but at a certain point, you need to sort of have this perspective I think that's challenging now in this time, that every time it's like, oh, maybe in 2 weeks, maybe in 3 weeks, maybe in 1 month, maybe in 2 months. And I can understand that puts a lot of pressure on long-term relationships.
I think also like having people just like think to themselves like, treat the uncertainty of when you're going to see someone as a sort of a little tease.
Yeah.
Be like, oh, maybe next week.
Yeah.
I think it is a little bit of perspective.
Yeah, and it's also enjoying the process. Meanwhile, it should not always be that everything you do is that building up until the actual deed. I mean, that's also part of sexuality. It's already a way of enjoying the process, enjoying what's still possible there.
And just like kind of living on the moment.
Yeah,
for the couple.
Exactly.
So I feel like, especially like you said, forgiveness during such an act is so important, because I think sometimes people just fixate on this one thing and they're like, oh wow, like it went so bad, never again, and then it's like it turns sour, and then also that sort of like over time has an effect on like the overall relationship then.
And if you can kind of laugh about it afterwards and talk about it, I think the most important thing is to remain excited, right? So you don't want to get into a position where you just impose expectations on yourself without addressing them, and without maybe saying, okay, maybe there are no expectations, and that way you can still stay excited about these sort of unfamiliar ways.
But it comes down to communication again, and
Yeah.
openly
Of
communicate.
course.
And if you do it, and you try out these new things, that you don't have to sort of have a formal evaluation, like, okay, let's see how it went, but at least talk about it, like, what was your experience and how did you feel about it? Yeah.
Yeah. So we're talking about long distance relationships, of course, cohabiting partners, and regardless of what type of relationship people have, there are of course some people who are in consensual non-monogamy.
Exactly.
And I feel like this is also very important to address. In times of COVID, this is a huge challenge.
Yeah.
How do you address that? So what do you think are some of the biggest, maybe obvious topics that people run into if they're...
Well, I think it obviously, indeed, I mean, we are talking about cohabiting couples, and for them, they can have sex as much as they want, whenever they want. But what about, indeed, open relationships, polyamorous relationships? I think what is important is making good agreements. Because what if one partner still wants to explore, and the other partner say, like, yeah, I want to sort of stick by the rules, and I don't want to see other partners anymore, and indeed play it safe. So, yeah, how do you deal with this? And if one partner decides to still engage in an open relationship and have sex with other partners, that you know at least that you can trust this partner, that he will take his or her precautions, and that you, making good agreements will be the most important, to reach some kind of consensus.
And it's essential either way. So be COVID or not, of course, making concrete, clear agreements on specific scenarios you might find yourself in is important. But with COVID, this is on a very different level, just for each other's safety.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's being pragmatic.
There should be consensus.
There should be consensus, and you need to be a little bit pragmatic, because you could say, oh, the rules say that you have to stick with one partner, but at the same time, okay, if you don't, what can you do? And there's things you can do, like ventilate your room and use clean sheets and protect, make sure that you're not too much touching and kissing.
Yeah, and you can also get tested.
Condoms.
Get tested.
Exactly.
I think the biggest benefit here is that you can just, look up the information, call the Cohabiting up, and be like, hey, I would like to get tested. Like that you are being not just responsible for them, but you're being responsible for yourself as well.
And it's also, indeed, you're responsible for yourself, responsible also for your partner. And I think, but it's the same, like if we think about protecting yourself for STIs and so on. I mean, it's the same, exactly. You wear a condom. If you're in a non-monogamous relationship, you will wear a condom with another partner because you want to protect your fixed partner. So, I mean, it's about taking care about yourself and others, and just being respectful toward each other, I think is important.
Yeah, but so more from, say, a well-being perspective within the relationship, being sort of okay with your partner and kind of being on the same page.
Yeah,
I feel like really important what you said, having a consensus, talking about these things. Yeah. Making agreements about them.
Yeah. I think it's especially in relationships in which you're consensual non-monogamous. I think that making agreements in general, apart from COVID, is important, and that consensus is a crucial part. So what we often see in this type of relationship, people are already quite good in openly communicating about what they want and what they don't want, because that's so often the only way to make that work. So I think just elaborate on that is very important. Yeah. So we talked about so many things. We covered so many topics. What I'm curious about is, like, what did you learn from this? What are you going to take away from this? How can you keep your relationship healthy and in these COVID times?
I think definitely for me it's communication, and not just within relationships, but in general. I think nowadays there's so much going on. People feel so stressed out, and if you don't communicate, or if you just skip out on the communication, it just leaves a lot of these blank spaces, and people will fill up these blank spaces with their own assumptions. So talk about it, talk about what's making you happy. If there's something your partner is doing that doesn't entirely, arouse you, or, it's not really fulfilling your sexual desires, then mention that. Yeah.
Even if it's uncomfortable.
Even when it's comfortable.
Yeah, indeed. And I think there's always just like, keep in mind that this is a very exceptional situation that everyone is going through, and know that you're not alone.
Yeah.
I think sometimes just this feeling of I am alone in this situation can be overburdening. So just, remember that you're not alone. There's a lot going on. Just talk about it, because talking is better than not talking.
Yeah. Exactly. And starting from a positive point of view, I think it's also important that you, when you talk, give these I messages and start from your own emotions and try not only focus on, hey, I don't like that, but it's also about, hey, this is what I like. Maybe I like this a little bit less, and
not making assumptions.
Not making
talking from the I
assumptions.
perspective,
No
not
mind reading.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, very good. And I like this coming out of a positive sort of because I was just about to say you can openly talk about things that are uncomfortable with this trust that it's going to be fine and you are in this together in that relationship, and then you're going to address these issues together, and you can trust that your partner is willing to discuss things. And I think that's then sort of the precursor to that that enables. What I definitely also took away is that you cannot just talk about COVID and its one impact on couples. That's just there is no norm, and so there's also no one situation that couples might find themselves in. There are very many different individuals and how individuals respond to COVID, being more stressed, being less stressed, being bored, being exhausted. And then also on a couple basis, of course, there are long distance couples, there are cohabiting couples, there are non-monogamous couples, there are monogamous couples.
I think about this idea of diversity and inclusivity is very important topic in sexology in general, but also in these specific times.
And seeing and taking into account how different individuals might be impacted in other ways, not assuming that everyone has the same situation that you have.
Great.
Sure.
Well, thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. And also hope that you all enjoyed it and that you enjoyed listening to this podcast. We'll come back to you with a new episode. And for now, stay safe and communicate to each other. That's important.
And thank you so much for hosting this.
Thanks for having us.